I must say, writing fiction, I've always had a problem with the side of making stuff up. Like, I get kind of exhausted mentally from just thinking I've got to make up something else, I've got to make up more characters, another plot twist. So writing in the explosion was nice in that I didn't have to make stuff up, I could research it. And so since people who lived through the explosion, there are still a few alive, but they tended to be a couple of years old at the explosion. So what I mostly did was books like Janet Kitz's Shattered City and a few other books. Like the Halifax, the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic has a really good exhibit, so I went there and watched a lot of documentaries. And I wanted to write a book that didn't feel like something that happened 92 years ago, but that's something that happened today, because like when people describe the explosion, they often say it was the largest man-made explosion before Hiroshima, which is true, but it's also the case that it was just the largest man-made explosion ever in the history of the world at that time. For the people who lived it, it wasn't smaller than Hiroshima, it was the biggest, it was the worst war disaster that had ever happened in Canada, and one of the worst single war disasters in the history of the world with that many killed. So it was a fun challenge to try and make that come alive. Yeah, one thing I did find interesting was the role that the soldiers played, and it was such a militaristic city at that point, and for most of its history it was. Like in modern Halifax, you do see the military and the Navy, but it's not that critical mass that it was in 1917, and it was critical in terms of that there were all these highly trained troops there who had been used to the sort of abattoir of the killing fields in World War I, so they weren't fazed by seeing it again in Halifax. And for some of them it would have been like training, it would have been like, when they recreate Afghanistan in Alberta now, this was like a live training exercise for a lot of them. Which my second character in the book is a reporter called Jack Krause, who is kind of helicoptered in, and he's trying to cover the story, and he's from out of town, so he doesn't have any personal connection to it. And I found his detachment really useful for writing it, so that Tommy's story is deeply involved in it. He's a very messed up, scattered man running through the ruins of the city and his life. But Jack has a more he's not personally involved, which as a reporter I often find that a funny sort of contrast, where you'll be at some sort of situation and it's clearly a tragedy, it's clearly an awful thing that's happened to somebody, but this is your job, you're not personally involved, you have to empathize with them, but it's a funny match when it's the worst thing that's ever happened to them, and it's Tuesday morning at the office for you. And so I think that was part of Jack's story, is trying to, as he gets more involved in the story personally and loses some of his objectivity.